The morning after my wife's funeral, the house felt too quiet to belong to the living. I was standing in the kitchen, still wearing the same dark sweater I had worn the day before. The coffee had gone cold in my hand, and the window above the sink showed a pale gray sky. Everything in that room still carried Martha's touch. Her blue mug by the dish rack, the folded kitchen towel she always kept near the stove, the small jar of cinnamon she used in almost everything once autumn began. I had not slept much. At my age, grief does not come like a storm. It comes like a slow weight pressing against your chest. It sits with you in silence. It follows you from room to room. And that morning, it was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, just as real as any person. Then my son came in. Daniel did not look at me right away. He opened a refrigerator, stared inside for a few seconds, then closed it again. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he was nervous. For a moment, I thought maybe he was about to say something kind. Maybe he would ask if I had eaten. Maybe he would sit down and talk to me about his mother. Instead, he pulled out a chair and said very quietly, "Dad, we need to talk about the house." I remember turning toward him with my cup still in my hand. "The house?" I asked. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the table. "It's too much for you now. Too big. Too expensive. Maybe it's time to sell it." I said nothing at first. I just looked at him, trying to understand how those words had found their way into this kitchen less than 24 hours after we buried his mother. The flowers from the funeral were still in the front room. Her coat was still hanging by the door. Even her reading glasses were still on the small table beside her chair. And my son wanted to talk about selling the house. At that moment, I did not realize how important that conversation would become. I thought it was grief speaking through him in some strange and ugly way. I thought maybe people say foolish things when they do not know how to sit with pain. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. So I set my cup down and asked him, "Why would you bring that up today?" He let out a long breath. "I'm only thinking ahead, Dad. That's all. You shouldn't be here alone." There are words that sound caring until you listen a little closer. That was one of them. I studied my son's face, and for the first time in many years, I felt a distance between us that I could not explain. He was my only child. I had held him the day he was born. I had taught him how to ride a bicycle in the same driveway outside. I had built the tree swing in the backyard with my own hands when he was 8 years old. Yet in that moment, sitting across from me in his mother's kitchen, he felt like someone I had to be careful around. Still, I kept my voice calm. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him. He pressed his lips together and gave a small nod, but I could see something restless moving behind his eyes. It passed quickly, and then he stood up and said he was going to make a few phone calls. Just like that, the conversation ended. But something had shifted in the room, and I felt it long after he walked away. Looking back now, I can see that was the first warning sign. My name is Walter Bennett. I was 68 years old when all of this happened. Until that winter, I had lived a simple life. I was never a rich man, and I never tried to be. For 39 years, I worked as a high school maintenance supervisor in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. It was steady work, honest work, the kind that left your knees sore by evening, but let you sleep with a clear mind. My wife, Martha, had been my whole world since I was 26. She was the sort of woman who made a house feel alive without ever trying to control it. She loved quiet things, early mornings, crossword puzzles, tomato plants in summer, soft lamplight in the evening. Even after 40 years of marriage, I still measure the rhythm of my days by her small habits, the sound of her slippers in the hallway, the way she hummed while peeling apples, the little notes she left near the bread box when she went to church or the store. When sickness came for her, it came slowly at first. We told ourselves it was just age, just fatigue, just one of those things doctors would sort out with medicine and rest. But some truths do not wait for you to be ready. Within a year, our life had become hospital visits, pill bottles, blankets on the sofa, and long quiet nights where neither of us said what we were both thinking. Daniel visited, of course, not often, but enough to say he did. He lived about 40 minutes away with his wife, Karen, and their little girl, Sophie. When he came by, Martha always lit up for him, no matter how tired she was. She smiled when she heard his car in the driveway. That is what makes the rest of this story harder to tell. Because love can blind you, not just romantic love. Family love, too. Sometimes we keep calling something love long after caution would have been wiser. And a few weeks after Martha was gone, I began to understand that the grief in my house was not the only thing waiting for me there. After that morning in the kitchen, Daniel acted as if nothing unusual had happened. He moved through the house quietly, like a guest trying not to disturb someone else's sleep. He would pick up a dish from the sink and rinse it, then leave it on the rack without drying it. He would stand in the hallway for a moment, looking at framed family photos like he was trying to remember where he belonged in them. Every so often, he would clear his throat and say, "You doing okay, Dad?" And when I nodded, he would accept that answer like a stamp on a form. The truth was, I was not okay, but I did not have the energy to explain grief to my own son. The days after funeral feel strange. People bring food you cannot taste. They speak in soft voices. They hug you and say, "She's in a better place," as if that sentence can fill the empty chair at your table. Then, slowly, everyone goes back to their normal life. You are left behind in a house that no longer sounds the way it used to. Some evenings, I would sit on the porch with a blanket over my legs and watch the sun fade behind the trees. The air was cold enough to make my fingers stiff. The neighborhood was quiet. A few cars passed now and then. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked at nothing. I would look at Martha's rose bushes along the walkway, covered in frost, and think about how she used to prune them in early spring. I kept thinking I would hear the back door open and her voice calling, "Walter, come inside before you catch a chill." But the door stayed closed. A few days after the funeral, Daniel went back to his own house. Karen and Sophie had only come for the service and a short visit afterward. Karen was polite but distant. She spoke in careful sentences, as if she did not want to leave fingerprints on my grief. Sophie hugged me once shyly, then spent the rest of the time staring at her tablet. When they left, the house grew even quieter. That was when the paperwork started. Some of it was simple. Thank you notes, phone calls to the church, canceling Martha's medical services, returning her walker to the hospital supply place. I did these things slowly, one at a time, like stepping across a frozen pond and hoping the ice would hold. Other things were heavier. The bank, insurance, bills that still arrived with her name on them, and the will. Martha and I had made our will years ago, back when we were both healthy and still believed old age was something far away. We updated it later after her diagnosis because she wanted everything clear. She hated confusion. She hated messy endings. I remember her sitting at the dining room table with a pen in her hand, her hair pulled back, reading every line carefully. She said, "Walter, people change when money enters the room, even family. Promise me you won't let anyone rush you." I had squeezed her hand and promised. At the time, I thought she was just being cautious. I would only understand the truth much later. Our house was not fancy, but was paid off. It was the kind of place you build a life inside. We bought it when Daniel was 5. It had creaky wooden floors and a porch swing that needed repainting. The backyard had an old maple tree that dropped leaves like gold in the fall. I had fixed things over the years. Roof patches, window frames, pipes under the sink. It held our whole story, room by room. Martha had wanted me to stay there as long as I was able. That is why Daniel's words about selling it sat in my mind like a stone. At first, I tried to excuse him. I told myself he was thinking about my safety, my age, the fact that living alone at 68 can feel like balancing on a narrow ledge. I told myself he was being practical, but practicality has a certain tone. It does not hide in nervous gestures. It does not avoid eye contact. It does not show up the morning after a funeral. 1 week later, Daniel invited me to lunch. We met at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind with warm booze and a chalkboard menu. The waitress brought me coffee without asking. That place had known me for years. Martha and I used to go there on Saturdays after the grocery store. Daniel sat across from me, tapping his phone on the table like he was waiting for an important message. He asked about my sleep. I said it was fine. He asked if I was eating. I said I was trying. He nodded, looking relieved, as if those simple answers allowed him to move on to what he really came to say. "Dad," he began, "Karen and I have been talking." That phrase, "Karen and I have been talking," made my stomach tighten a little. It sounded like a decision had already been made, and I was only being informed. "We think it's best if you sell the house," he said, "and maybe move closer to us. There's a nice retirement community near our neighborhood." I stared at him. "A retirement community," I repeated. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if kindness could be measured by volume. "It would be safer, and the house money could help. You know, for the future." "The future?" I said again, quietly. Daniel gave a quick nod. "You could use the money for care if you ever need it. And, well, it would make things easier for everyone." That last part stayed with me. Easier for everyone. Not safer for me. Not comforting for me. Easier for everyone. I set my hands flat on the table and took a slow breath. I did not want to argue. I did not want to create a scene. The diner was full of people eating soup and talking about weather. Life moved on for them. My grief was not their business. So I asked calmly, "Why the rush, Daniel?" He paused. His eyes flicked away for a second, then returned. "There's no rush," he said. "I'm just trying to help." But he said it the way someone says a line they practiced. At the time, I thought it was a small thing. It wasn't. After lunch, he walked me to my car, patted my shoulder, and said, "Think about it, okay? I'll come by this weekend. We can talk more." When I drove home, I kept the radio off. The silence in the car felt cleaner than the sound of music. I watched the winter fields pass by, gray and empty. I thought about Martha's promise request. I thought about Daniel's words. I thought about that strange energy in his face, like impatience hidden under concern. That night, I sat in Martha's chair in the living room, the one by the lamp. I looked around at the flowers that were now drying in their vases, petals curling and falling like tired hands. I held her cardigan in my lap and breathed in the faint scent of her soap. Then I made a quiet decision. Before I let anyone push me out of my home, I would understand exactly what was happening. And that meant I needed to look at things I had been avoiding. Papers, accounts, names, dates. Not because I wanted to suspect my own son, but because something in my heart had begun to whisper that I had to be careful. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was dark and still. The heater clicked on and off like it was trying not to bother me. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the quiet. Then I put on my robe and walked down the hallway. When you live in a house for decades, you know every sound it makes. You know which floorboard complains near the bathroom. You know which window rattles when the wind turns. That morning, each small sound felt louder than usual, like the house was awake too. I went into Martha's little office corner in the dining room. It was not a real office, just a small desk near the window with a lamp and a drawer full of papers. Martha kept everything there. Bills, receipts, insurance letters, birthday cards, even old grocery lists she could not bring herself to throw away. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a thick folder labeled in her handwriting, House Plus Finances. Seeing her writing made my throat tighten. It was neat and rounded, the way she wrote in her church notes. I sat down slowly and ran my thumb along the edge of the folder. "All right," I whispered to myself. "Let's do this the right way." I started with the basics. The deed, the mortgage papers showing it was paid off years ago, the property tax records. Everything looked normal at first. Everything looked like the life Martha and I had built together, plain and honest. Then I moved to the bank statements. I had always trusted Martha with the small details, not because I was careless, but because she liked doing it. She liked being organized. She handled the checkbook. She tracked bills. I handled the repairs, the yard work, the heavy things. It was a balance we never had to discuss. But now she was gone, and I had to carry her side of the balance too. I went through the statements slowly, line by line. At first, there was nothing strange. Grocery store purchases, utilities, her pharmacy, a few church donations. Then I noticed something that made me pause. A transfer. It was not a huge amount, but it was enough to stand out. A few $1,000s moved from one account to another. The account number it went to was not familiar to me. I leaned closer and adjusted my glasses. I checked the date. It was from 2 months before Martha passed. My first thought was simple. Maybe it was medical. Maybe it was something Martha set up for hospital costs. Or maybe she had moved money into a separate account for safety. She was careful like that. Still, I felt that small whisper again. Pay attention, Walter. So I kept going. There were more transfers. Not every week, but enough to form a pattern. Always the same destination account. Always amounts that were not small, but not large enough to scream for attention. Looking back now, I can see how someone could miss it, especially someone grieving, especially someone who trusted his family. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pages, trying to keep my breathing steady. Then the phone rang. It was Daniel. His name flashed on the screen, and for a moment, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the phone like it was a hot plate. Then I answered. Hello, I said. Dad, he said, cheerful in a forced way. Just checking in. How you holding up? I'm managing, I replied. There was a pause, short but noticeable. Then he said, So, did you think about what we talked about? The house. Again, I looked at the bank statement in front of me, at the transfer line that still felt like a question mark. I'm thinking, I said carefully. He chuckled softly. Good, because Karen found a realtor friend. Really nice guy. No pressure, but we could have him stop by and give you a quick estimate. Just so you know what the place is worth. My stomach tightened. A realtor? I repeated. Yeah, Daniel said quickly. It's just information, Dad. You don't have to sign anything. I watched the weak winter light coming through the window. It landed on Martha's folder like a pale spotlight. My voice stayed calm, but my words came out firmer than I expected. No, I said. There was silence on the line. No, Daniel repeated, his tone shifting slightly. No realtor, I said. Not right now. Another pause. Then he let out a breath that sounded like frustration he was trying to hide. Okay, he said. Okay, Dad. Of course. I just thought it would help. It won't, I replied. He said goodbye quickly after that, his voice tight at the edges. When I set the phone down, my hand was shaking a little. Not from anger, from the feeling that something was moving around me, quietly, like a shadow in the corner of a room. I went back to the statements. I needed answers, but I needed them carefully. I did not want to accuse anyone. I did not want to jump to conclusions. Martha would not have wanted that. She would have wanted facts. So I did what an old maintenance man does when something is broken, and he does not know why. I checked every piece, step by step. By afternoon, I had made a small list on a notepad. Transfer dates, amounts, the last 4 digits of the unknown account. Then I found something else. A letter. It was tucked between 2 insurance papers, almost hidden. The envelope was already opened, and Martha's name was on it. The return address was the bank. My heart gave a dull thump. I pulled the letter out and read it slowly. It was a notification about an additional authorized user being added to one of our accounts. My eyes moved across the page until they landed on the name, Daniel Bennett. For a moment, I could not breathe properly. Daniel had access. Not full ownership, not yet, but access. The kind that could explain those transfers. The kind that could also explain the sudden urgency about selling the house. I sat very still, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. At the time, I told myself there must be an explanation. Martha might have done it for convenience during her illness. She might have thought Daniel could help if something happened to her. That sounded reasonable. But what did not sound reasonable was Daniel pushing to sell the house immediately after her funeral. And what did not sound reasonable was money leaving our account 2 months before she died. I would only understand the truth much later. That evening, I did not turn on the television. I did not eat much. I made a small bowl of soup and sat at the kitchen table alone, listening to the spoon tap against the bowl. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees. The porch light cast a soft yellow circle onto the steps. The rest of the yard was dark. After dinner, I walked into the living room and stood in front of the fireplace mantel. There was a photo of Martha and me from our 40th anniversary. We were smiling, holding hands, looking tired but happy. I touched the edge of the frame. "Martha," I whispered, "what did you know?" And then, for the first time since she passed, I felt something besides sadness. I felt a quiet, steady determination, because whether Daniel was making a mistake or making a plan, I would not let my life be taken from me while I was still standing. And I was already beginning to understand why Martha had made me promise. The next 2 days passed slowly, but my mind did not rest. Grief is heavy enough on its own. Suspicion makes it heavier. It sits beside you in silence and changes the shape of every memory. I kept trying to give Daniel the benefit of the doubt. I kept telling myself there might be a simple reason for everything. But each time I repeated that thought, it felt weaker. On Thursday morning, I drove to the bank. The sky was white with low winter clouds, and a thin layer of snow still clung to the edges of the sidewalks. I parked near the entrance and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running. My hands were on the steering wheel, and I could see my breath fogging the windshield. I felt foolish, almost ashamed. No father wanted to walk into a bank to ask quiet questions about his own son. But shame does not protect you. Facts do. Inside, the bank smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. A young man at the front desk asked if I needed help, and I told him I needed to speak with someone about an account. He led me to a small office with glass walls and a woman named Linda, who looked to be in her 50s. She wore a navy sweater and had the kind of calm face people trust with difficult things. I explained as much as I could without saying too much. I told her my wife had recently passed. I told her I was reviewing our finances. I showed her the letter and asked about the added authorized user. Linda read the document, then typed quietly on her computer. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Your son, Daniel Bennett, was added to the account last year." "Added by whom?" I asked. She looked at the screen again. The request appears to have been signed by both account holders. That made my chest tighten. Both account holders meant Martha and me, but I had never signed anything like that. I kept my face still. "May I see the paperwork?" Linda gave me a careful look, not suspicious, more concerned. Then she said, "I can print a copy for you." When she placed the paper in front of me, I looked first at Martha's signature. It was hers, weak and slightly uneven, but hers. Then I looked at the second signature. My name was written there, Walter Bennett, but it was not my handwriting. It was close enough to pass at a glance. The shape was similar. The letters leaned the right way, but it was not mine. After 40 years of signing checks, school forms, tax papers, and repair invoices, I knew my own hand better than I knew my own face. Someone had signed my name, and suddenly the room felt smaller. At that moment, I didn't realize how far it had already gone. I only knew one thing for certain. This was not a misunderstanding anymore. I looked up at Linda and asked very quietly, "Can you tell when this was done?" She gave me the date. It was during one of Martha's hospital stays. I remember staring at that date like it belonged to someone else's life. I had barely been sleeping during those weeks. I was living between home and hospital. I was carrying overnight bags, talking to doctors, sitting beside Martha's bed while machines made soft sounds in the dark. If a paper had been placed in front of her then, she might have signed it believing it was something harmless. Or she might have trusted Daniel if he told her it was to help manage the bills. That thought hurt more than I can describe, because betrayal is one thing. Using a sick mother's trust is another. Linda asked if I wanted to place restrictions on the account. Her voice sounded distant for a moment, like I was hearing it through water. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said. "Please." She explained the steps. New security measures. Limited access. A formal note on the account. She also suggested I speak with an attorney, especially if I believed my signature had been forged. The word forged sat cold in the room. Not mistaken. Not borrowed. Not misunderstood. Forged. When I left the bank, I stood outside under the gray sky and let the cold air hit my face. Cars moved past on the road. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang once. Everything looked normal. That was the strangest part. The world does not change its color when your heart does. I drove home slowly. I kept seeing Daniel as a little boy in the backseat of my truck, asking if we could stop for ice cream. I kept seeing him at 12, standing in the backyard with grass stains on his jeans. I kept seeing him at 25, nervous on his wedding day. Those memories did not disappear just because new facts had entered the room. They stood beside those facts and made them harder to hold. When I got home, there was a car in my driveway, Daniel's. I turned off my engine and stayed seated for a second, staring at the house. The curtains in the front room were half open. His shape moved past the window. My first feeling was not anger. It was exhaustion. I picked up the envelope from the bank, tucked it under my coat, and stepped out of the car. Daniel opened the front door before I reached it. "Dad," he said, "where were you?" I called. I looked at him carefully. He seemed tense, alert in a way that told me he had not come by for a casual visit. "I was out," I said. He stepped aside to let me in, then followed me into the kitchen. The room felt colder than usual, though the heat was on. There was an envelope on the table and a pen beside it. I looked from the pen to Daniel. "What's this?" I asked. He rubbed his hands together. "Nothing major. I just thought maybe we should start organizing things. You know, getting ahead of paperwork." I did not sit down. "What paperwork?" He picked up the envelope and slid a few papers out. "Just some preliminary stuff. Not selling yet. More like preparing. If something happens. If you decide you want help managing the property." Managing the property. He spoke like the house was already halfway out of my hands. I took one of the pages and looked at the top. It was not a sale contract. Not exactly. It was a property consultation agreement connected to a real estate office. There was also a form about representation. My name was typed neatly in 2 places. "No," I put the papers down. "I told you no realtor," I said. Daniel sighed and tried a small smile, the kind people use when they think patience will make pressure seem gentle. "Dad, listen, you're overwhelmed right now. I'm trying to help before things get messy." "They are already messy," I said. He blinked. "What does that mean?" For a moment, I almost told him about the bank right there. I almost held up the printed signature and asked him how low a man had to fall before he used his dying mother to open a door into his father's life. But I did not. Something in me wanted to hear what he would say if given room. So I asked, "Why are you in such a hurry, Daniel?" He looked away, then back at me. "I'm not in a hurry. You brought a realtor's paperwork into my house. It's just information. The day after your mother's funeral, you wanted to talk about selling. A week later, you wanted estimates. Now you're bringing papers." I kept my voice low. "So I'm asking you again. Why are you in such a hurry?" His face changed then, only slightly, but enough. The softness dropped for half a second, and underneath it I saw something sharp. Impatience, maybe even resentment. Then he said the sentence I still hear sometimes when the house is quiet. "Because this place is going to be mine eventually anyway." The words landed between us like a plate dropped on tile. I stared at him. He seemed to realize too late that he had said the quiet part out loud. His jaw tightened. He looked down, then up again. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "I just mean it makes sense to plan ahead." But that wasn't the part that surprised me the most. What surprised me was how calm I felt. Not because I was not hurt. I was, but because, at last, something had become clear. I looked at my son for a long moment after he said it. The kitchen was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. The late afternoon light came through the window in pale stripes, falling across the table, the papers in Daniel's hands. He had placed those hands flat on the wood now, as if he could steady the moment by keeping still. But some moments cannot be steadied. Once spoken, certain words never go back where they came from. Mine eventually, I repeated. Daniel swallowed. "Dad, that's not what I meant." I kept my eyes on him. "Then what did you mean?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked tired, irritated, trapped. Not like a grieving son. More like a man whose plan had been delayed. That was the hardest part to witness. When a stranger disappoints you, it wounds a day. When your child disappoints you, it reaches backward into years and touches everything. Finally, he said, "I'm just trying to be realistic." I nodded once. Realistic, I said. He took a step closer and lowered his voice. Dad, you're alone now. This house is too much. The market is good. If we do this right, we can get a strong price. You could move somewhere smaller, closer to us. Easier to manage. Easier for Sophie to visit. Easier for all of us. Again that phrase. Easier for all of us. I thought about the bank papers hidden under my coat. I thought about the false signature. I thought about Martha in that hospital bed, weak and trusting, signing something she may not have fully understood because the person asking was her own son. Then I asked him a question I had been holding inside all day. Did your mother know what she was signing? Daniel froze. It was only for a second, but that second told me everything. His face changed, and I saw fear move through it like a shadow crossing water. Not fear for me, not fear for our family. Fear of being caught. After that, no explanation in the world could sound innocent. He looked away first. Dad, he said slowly, I don't know what you think you found, but I went to the bank. That stopped him. The room became very still. I saw the authorization papers. I continued. I saw my name signed by somebody who wasn't me. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. He did not speak. I'm giving you one chance, I said. Tell me the truth. He turned toward the window, rubbing his jaw with one hand. For a while, he said nothing. Outside, the bare branches moved lightly in the wind. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a car door slammed. Ordinary life kept going while mine stood there, waiting. Then Daniel gave a tired sigh and pulled out a chair. He sat down heavily, like a man who had decided pretending was no longer worth the effort. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said. That was his beginning. Not I'm sorry. Not I made a mistake. Just that I stayed standing. He looked at the table as he spoke. Karen and I have been under pressure for a while. More than you know. Credit cards. The mortgage. Her brother borrowed money and never paid us back. Then Sophie's school costs went up. Things got bad. I listened without interrupting. He kept going. When Mom got sick, she started talking about making sure everything was settled. She said she didn't want you struggling with paperwork if something happened. So I offered to help. That's all it was at first. At first, I repeated. He nodded weakly. I asked her to add me to the account. I told her it would make bill paying easier if she was in the hospital. She agreed. She said you were exhausted and didn't need more stress. That part I believed. It sounded like Martha. She would always choose ease for other people, even when she was the one suffering. But my signature? I asked. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. She said you would agree, he murmured. That is not what I asked. He pressed his lips together. Then he said it. I signed it. The words fell quietly. No drama, no tears, just the plain truth at last. I felt my chest tighten, but my voice stayed even. You forged my name. He gave a small nod. Yes. I looked at him and saw two people at once. The boy who once ran into my arms after falling off his bike, and the man sitting at my kitchen table admitting he had forged my name while his mother was dying. That is the cruelty of family betrayal. It does not replace the old memories. It stands on top of them. How much? I asked. Daniel looked up, confused. How much money did you take? His eyes dropped again. Not all at once. That is not an answer. He rubbed both hands over his face. Around $32,000. For a few seconds, I could not speak. $32,000. Not millions. Not enough to make headlines. But enough to matter. Enough to change the shape of a retirement. Enough to betray trust in a way that does not heal cleanly. Enough to explain the rush to sell the house. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly. And selling the house? I asked. He answered without looking at me. We thought if it sold, you'd have enough money not to notice what was missing right away. Or maybe you just think it went to expenses, medical costs, taxes, something like that. There it was, the full truth, not confusion, not poor judgment in a desperate week. A plan, a quiet, careful plan. At that moment, I did not feel rage. I wish I could tell you I slammed my hand on the table or threw him out or shouted so loud the neighbors heard. But I did not. That would have been easier in some ways. Anger can warm a person for a little while. What I felt was colder than anger. I felt grief a second time, not for Martha, for the son I thought I had. I looked around the kitchen while he sat there staring at the table, the tea tin by the stove, the small crack in the tile near the sink that I always meant to repair, the curtain Martha sewed herself 15 years ago, all of it so familiar, all of it now holding a conversation I never imagined could happen in this house. Finally, I asked, "Did Karen know?" Daniel hesitated too long. "Yes," he said. That answer hurt less than I expected. Maybe because by then, hurt had already reached its limit. "She pushed for the sale," he added quietly. "She said if we didn't act soon, you'd change things. She said once lawyers got involved, everything would be harder." He laughed then, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness. Looks like she was right. I folded my hands in front of me and breathed slowly. Looking back now, that was a true turning point. Not the forged paper, not the missing money, not even the house plans. It was the moment Daniel stopped pretending to be my worried son and became what he had chosen to be instead, a man calculating what his father was worth. He looked up at me then. Finally, his eyes were red, but I could not tell whether it was shame or stress or fear. Maybe all three. "Dad," he said softly, "I know this looks bad." "It is bad," I replied. He nodded once. "I can fix it." I remember how strange those words sounded. I can fix it. As if trust were a pipe under the sink. As if betrayal could be tightened with a wrench. He leaned forward. "I'll pay it back. Not all at once, but over time. We can work something out. Please don't make this bigger than it needs to be. There are sentences that reveal more than confessions do." That one told me he still did not understand what he had done. This was not about money anymore. It was about dignity. About the last promise I made to my wife. About whether I would allow grief to turn me into an easy target. I stood up. "You need to leave," I said. Daniel's face tightened. "Dad, you need to leave my house." He stood too. "Please, let's just talk calmly." I am calm. And I was. That was what frightened him. I think, not shouting, not threats. Calmness. Calmness means the thinking is clear. I picked up the papers from the table and handed them back to him. "You will not bring real estate papers into this house again," I said. "You will not ask me about selling. You will not touch another dollar that belongs to me. And until I decide what happens next, you will stay away unless I ask you to come." His mouth opened, but no words came. Then, very quietly, I added, "Your mother trusted you." For the first time, he looked like the weight of that truth had finally reached him. But by then it was too late. "That is not my problem," I told him. More silence. Then he said softer, "You're really going to do this?" "I am," I answered. He sounded smaller then. "You're going to cut me off." I closed my eyes. "No," I said. "You cut yourself off when you decided my grief made me easy." I hung up after that, not with satisfaction, but with tired sadness. The letter went out 3 days later. Mr. Harlan copied Daniel, and Karen both. It stated the amount taken, the dates of transfers, the disputed signature, and a repayment plan with deadlines. It was polite in tone, but firm in meaning. It also made it clear that if repayment did not begin, further legal action could follow. When Daniel showed up at my house after receiving it, I did not open the door right away. I saw him through the curtain. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. He looked like a boy again for a moment, waiting for his father to decide if he could come inside. But then I remembered the forge name. I opened the door only partway, keeping the chain latched. "Dad," he said, eyes shining, "please, don't do this." I looked at him quietly. "I didn't do this." He swallowed hard. We were desperate. "Desperation doesn't give you my signature," I replied. He flinched as if the words physically hurt. "I didn't want to hurt you," he whispered. I held his gaze. "Then why did you—" He stared at the porch boards. "I thought you'd be okay. I thought you had the house, you had savings. I thought you wouldn't feel it." That sentence was so honest and so ugly that it made my stomach turn, because it told me he had measured my pain in numbers. I spoke gently but clearly. "You don't get to decide what I feel," I said, "and you don't get to decide what I can afford to lose." His eyes filled, and he nodded like a man finally seeing the edge of a cliff he had been walking toward. "Is there any way back?" he asked. I took a slow breath. "There may be," I said, "but it won't be fast. And it won't be cheap, not in money, in truth, in time, in change." He nodded again. "I'll pay it back." "I hope you do," I replied. "For your own sake." He reached toward the door as if he wanted to touch my arm, but the chain stopped him from coming closer. He pulled his hand back and wiped his face quickly, embarrassed by his own tears. "Can I at least see Sophie?" he asked. "She misses you." My chest tightened at my granddaughter's name. I loved Sophie. That love did not disappear because her parents made choices. But I also knew how people can use a child like a bridge to cross boundaries. "I will decide when I see Sophie," I said, "and it will be on my terms." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He only nodded and stepped back from the door. As he walked down the steps, he said quietly, "Mom would hate this." I didn't raise my voice. "Your mother would hate what you did," I said. He stopped for a moment, then kept walking. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at Martha's folder again. The same folder that had once held ordinary life papers now held proof of betrayal and the beginnings of protection. But that wasn't the part that surprised me the most. What surprised me was the sense of quiet strength growing in me. Not because I enjoyed any of it, because I realized something important. Being kind does not mean being unprotected. The repayment did not happen all at once. It came in small pieces, like a broken thing being glued back together slowly. The first payment arrived 2 weeks after the letter. Daniel transferred a modest amount into my account with a short message that simply said, "First payment. More coming." No apology, no explanation. Just proof that he understood the pressure was real now. Every month after that, more arrived. Some months it was a larger amount, some months smaller. I could almost see the shape of their life through the numbers. A month with extra money, a month with trouble, a month where they were trying. I did not ask questions. I did not chase them. I let the attorney handle the structure, the reminders, the paper trail. I kept my own life quiet. I fixed the loose step on the porch that had been bothering Martha for years. I patched a small leak under the kitchen sink. I replaced the porch light bulb. Simple jobs that made the house feel steady again. When you lose someone, you learn that small tasks can save you. They give your hand something to do while your heart catches up. On Sundays, I still went to church. The first few times were hard. People looked at me with pity, and pity is a strange kind of noise. It makes you feel like your grief belongs to everyone else too. But over time, it got easier. I sat in the same pew Martha, and I always sat in, and I listened to the hymns. Sometimes I sang, sometimes I didn't. Either way, I felt her there in the quiet moments between words. A month after Daniel's confession, I updated my will. Mr. Harlan helped me create a simple trust. Nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, just clear and protected. I named a neutral executor, a man from church I trusted, so no one could pressure me later. I arranged things so the house could never be sold without proper steps, proper time, and proper consent. I also set something aside for Sophie, not because Daniel deserved it, but because Sophie was innocent. She was a child who still loved her grandfather's stories and asked for pancakes when she visited. She should not lose stability because adults acted selfishly. At the time, I thought this would be the end of it. But a few weeks later, Daniel called again. Not about money, not about the house. He called late in the evening. The sun had already gone down, and the living room was lit only by the lamp beside Martha's chair. I was sitting with a blanket over my legs, listening to the wind against the windows, when the phone rang. I hesitated, then answered. "Dad," Daniel said, and his voice sounded different. Not rushed, not defensive, tired in a softer way. "Yes," I replied. There was a long pause. Then he said, "I'm sorry." He did not say it loudly. He did not say it like a performance. He said it like something heavy finally being put down. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the small framed photo of Martha on the mantel, the one where she was smiling with a scarf around her hair, standing in the garden with dirt on her hands. She looked happy in that picture, like she had never known hospitals or paperwork or betrayal. "I'm listening," I said quietly. Daniel breathed in. "I told myself it was just money, that you had enough, that you wouldn't notice. But the truth is, I was scared, and I was weak. And Karen kept saying it was your house, sitting there, just waiting, while we were drowning." He stopped, and I could hear him swallowing on the other end. "And I let myself believe that," he continued. "I did something I can't defend. I forged your name, Dad. I used Mom's trust. I don't know how to fix what I did." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't turn it into drama. It stayed low, almost ashamed. I held the phone and breathed slowly. In that moment, I understood something that surprised me. An apology does not erase harm, but it tells you whether the person has finally looked at the harm without flinching. I asked, "Where's Karen right now?" He paused. "Upstairs. She's furious that I called you." That answer was honest too. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "Daniel," I said, "you can't build a good life by stealing pieces of someone else's." "I know," he whispered. "And you can't call it family while you're taking." I added, "I know," he said again, quieter. "I know." Another silence passed. Then he said, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it carefully. Hate is loud. Hate consumes. I didn't have the strength for it, and I didn't want it in my later years. Martha used to say bitterness is a kind of poison you drink hoping someone else will feel sick. I had no interest in that. So I answered truthfully. "No," I said, "but I'm hurt, and I don't trust you right now." He made a small sound, like relief mixed with pain. "I understand," he said. "I'm glad you're paying it back," I continued. "Not just because of the money, because it shows you're facing what you did. Keep doing that." "I will," he said. "And about Sophie," I added, "I want to see her, but it will be steady and simple. No pressure. No hidden conversations. No using her as a bridge." "I won't," he said quickly. "I promise." Promises are tricky things after betrayal, but I let the moment sit. A few days later, Sophie came to visit with Daniel, not Karen. Daniel asked if that was okay. I said yes, but I stayed careful. They came on a Saturday afternoon. The sun was out, and snow sparkled in little patches along the yard. Sophie ran inside like she always did, taking her shoes off too late, leaving wet socks on the entry rug. "Grandpa!" she called, and she hugged me with her whole small body. For a moment, I closed my eyes and held her gently, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. My heart softened in a way that surprised me. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. But because love still lived in the places where greed tried to step. Daniel stood by the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure what he was allowed to feel. That was the consequence he had earned. Trust does not return quickly. It returns the way spring returns after winter. Slow, quiet, and only if the cold stops fighting it. We baked simple cookies that afternoon. Sophie stirred the dough and got flour on her nose. I pretended not to notice until she looked up at me. Then I gently wiped it away. Daniel sat at the table, silent, watching the kitchen the way people watch a place that used to belong to them. At one point, Sophie asked, "Grandpa, can I sleep over someday?" I looked at Daniel before answering. He nodded slightly, like he was giving me permission I didn't need. I turned back to Sophie. "Someday," I said softly. "Yes, someday." After they left, I stood on the porch again as the evening light faded. The street was quiet. The sky was pale pink near the horizon. The porch swing moved gently, and the wind smelled like cold wood and distant chimney smoke. I thought about Martha. I thought about how she warned me, and how right she was. People do change when money enters the room. Even family, especially family sometimes. But I also thought about something else. I had not lost my dignity. I had not been pushed out of my home. I had not been rushed into selling the life I built, because I was already prepared, not with revenge, with clarity, with paperwork. with boundaries, with the quiet strength to say, no, even when my own son wanted me to bend. And if there is one lesson I carry now, it is this. Love should be generous, but it should never be blind. You can forgive someone and still protect yourself. You can keep your heart soft and your boundaries firm. And you can grieve deeply without letting grief make you easy to break. That house is still mine, not because I want to fight, but because I chose self-respect in a moment when it would have been easier to give in. And in the quiet evenings, when the porch light glows and the kitchen feels still, I sometimes speak Martha's name under my breath, not with bitterness, with gratitude, because even after she was gone, her careful wisdom helped me stay standing.